Hey everyone, I'm Mikey Pruitt. Welcome to another episode of DNS Unfiltered. Today I'm joined by Tony Black from Huntress, a SIM expert. Tony, why don't you say hello and give us a little introduction?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Mikey. So, as said, my name's Tony Black. I've been doing cybersecurity now for, God, it's 15, 16 years across a multitude of roles as an engineer and analyst, working with firewalls, working with DLP solutions, kind of you name it from the cybersecurity kind of tool perspective. And I've worked with it, done a bunch of security operations. And now my current role at Huntress is as a product researcher on our new SIM platform.
Yeah, so Huntress has a new SIM platform. Very cool. And Tony had mentioned while we were kind of introducing ourselves to each other backstage that, he has that 15, 16 years as an operator, trying to figure out the alerts that matter and how to triage them. So we're going to geek out on that in a minute. But first, let's talk about this Huntress integration. Give us like just a quick overview of the, sorry, not the integration, the SIM that Huntress has released.
Yeah. So it's been in or was in early access in late summer through August. We started to onboard full bore customers and partners in the October timeframe. And a lot of the functionality we have right now is around, hey, let's collect log data, let's get into the system, let's make it searchable and visible. We are, continually in the process of delving through that, identifying, hey, these are things that we want to have our SOC investigate. As you can imagine, right, with most logging infrastructure and logging platforms, there's just a deluge of potential data that can be collected and ingested, and not all of it is useful, not all of it is helpful. After all, logs at their core are just a recording of something that happened, and not everything that happens is interesting. There are some things that are just, hey, I've been awake for a day. Like, cool, thanks, Windows. I'm glad that you've been up. Your uptime is a day longer than it was before. Uh, so yeah, it's a lot of analysis work that we're doing on that end to ensure that we maintain the same level of efficacy and low false positive rate that our partners have been expecting from our EDR and our ITDR products.
That's interesting. So, I mean, Huntress, the nature of your business, you're going to need a pretty powerful tool to collect all of those logs. So, did you guys kind of build this for yourselves and then it was just good enough to release?
Yeah, we did. So like the initial kind of groundwork was laid before I joined Huntress. So I've been with Huntress now since the beginning of July. So the original kind of groundwork was laid back in January, from my understanding, where it was started to get built out. Our CTO Chris, like he delved into it quite a bit. He's talked a lot about it on our product webinars that we host once a month, and has kind of been a running topic now for quite some time. So yeah, like we built the collection and ability to collect things, the ability to do some parsing and normalization, because that's a very important part when you have a bunch of different sources that call things different stuff. And then a storage backend to store and make this available for not only just the search side, but also so that we can for bad behavior.
Okay, so before we go any further, I think it would be wise to give the audience like a basic definition of SIM. And actually, let's start with the pronunciation. So I say SIM, which I thought was correct for a few years, but you can correct me. Like, what is a SIM and why should you use one?
So, SIM solutions, and it's SIEM is the acronym. So, Security, Information, and Event Management. That's been around now for 20-ish years, maybe slightly more. It's actually an amalgam of two things. So, there was something called SIM, so Security, Information Management, and SEM, Security, Event Management. And they kind of merged the two together somewhere in the mid-aughts. Some of the first products that came about around then were ArcSight was one of the first big names in the SIM space, as was RSA and Vision. Back in that mid-aught period was also really big in the space. Both of those products, ArcSight has more or less disappeared. from existence. There are still some places out there that use it, but for the most part, that product has, kind of sunsetted the same way that your old packet filters no longer really exist in comparison to what's been coined the next gen firewall. And then RSA and Vision kind of merged and transformed itself into what's now called RSA Net Witness. So those two kind of components, the SIM, SEM, merged together and became SIEM because they're like, hey, let's do not just collect stuff, but let's try and do some intelligence against it. And yeah, for as far as pronunciation, I've seen people call it SIEM, and SIM. Like it's pretty much SIM has been like the way that if you listen to Gartner or any of the other folks talking about the product space, they always pronounce it SIM.
Yeah. So if you want to sound like you know what you're talking about, say SIM.
Yep,
So
say
why
SIM.
would someone use it? Why would someone use a SIM?
Yeah, so again, I'll use another example of a product kind of in this space. So a lot of people recognize Splunk as a big name kind of in this space too, and Splunk started their business started as an observability tool. So what they did is they were collecting kind of a whole bunch of data and then trying to make intelligent kind of IT operational / business type decisions, or at least information, get reporting and those types of bits out of it. And if you think of what a SIM is in comparison, a SIM is a very similar-ish kind of tool, kind of product, just with a much more narrow focus. So instead of looking at kind of the entire IT infrastructure and trying to facilitate what a network operations center might need around, hey, my the health of my network devices or the health of my server infrastructure, if you're into server operations as a server admin, it really narrows in and focuses on the security aspect. Now, that being said, there's a lot of overlap in data between kind of those two big use cases. So, a lot of things that from the IT operational side, so in the observability space, I'm going to care about. There's a lot of overlap with what I care about on the security side of things as well. So think of it this way: like in my past, I was responsible for uh, VPN access, right? Managing the tokens, so the multi-factor tokens that you would use to connect in, and then the corresponding kind of bits behind the scenes for how that actually connected in. Well, the tool that I would use, to troubleshoot some of those things, which we're looking at the different authentication checks. It's like, hey, yep, my password is good, and then yeah, now my token is good. Cool. Like that same infrastructure and the same logs I would use to troubleshoot a connectivity issue and also look at security issues around, someone's account being breached and or something funky with their tokens or them not having a token for some reason. So there's a lot of overlap between kind of those the original like observability use case and then the more narrow focused security side of it. So
Very
yeah,
cool.
the wrapping back, like what do you need it for? Like it gives you kind of that infrastructure, that capability to delve into security data and to uh, create either whether it be search based or whether it be more real time based, some level of detective capability based upon some known criteria of a known bad thing, and then alert you of this to allow you to investigate, qualify, and either remediate if it is a true positive or put it into a false positive category, and then improve your detection from that point forward. They're also really big in the kind of compliance and reporting space. So when you look at a lot of the compliance regulations, PCI, HIPAA, Sarbanes-Oxley, GDPR, like just the pick your flavor of whichever compliance requirement, almost all of them have some level of need to or some level of requirement to move your logs off of the originating system from either an investigative perspective or just a auditing perspective. So using HIPAA as an example, right? One of the requirements in HIPAA is, hey, you need to log anytime someone accesses, EMR records. So, PHI, anything that has PHI in it, not just changes to it, but even just viewing it is something that has to get recorded. Now, that use case isn't necessarily the greatest in the SIM space because that is a ridiculous amount of data that doesn't necessarily have security, overall security value, at least out of the gate. But that's kind of an example of something where these types of tools provide value.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense now. So your your SIM is really just filtering the important stuff, specifically related to security. Is that
Yeah,
right?
and that's kind of a bit of a shift too, in terms of how the industry has been treating data collection. I think that that's kind of an area of differentiation we're starting to see nowadays in the market space too. So if you look, say, eight, even as new as 5-ish years ago, the general guidance from your SIM vendors was, hey, collect all the stuff and shove it all into our tool, and then now it's available for searching, and now you can do whatever you want with it. Whereas now, that's kind of shifting a little bit. You've got players such as Cribble, such as what is it, Databon, and you've got these other tools that are coming out in support of these solutions, but they're really kind of sitting in the front and playing kind of the gatekeeper or the filter or the traffic cop in some cases for data coming in. And that's something, when you're talking about kind of Huntress's SIM solution as well, that's something we were looking at too. And it's like, hey, we don't need to collect all the things all the time. It's like, let's make sure we can narrow in on that, which is providing kind of that security value from a detective and investigation perspective, and then kind of not bringing in those things that are, hey, this is purely IT operations or this is purely for like device health, which sure there is a little bit of a crossover in kind of security space around health too, as part of the CIA triad, right? Things need to be available for it to actually be in the business. But like, there's better tools to handle that besides SIM solutions. And Huntress's perspective is always we want to focus on the tradecraft, the attacker, and catch them before they're able to do or be able to execute, ultimately whatever their mission is.
Yeah, so it sounds like the Huntress solution is pretty focused, which is great. I'm curious, what are some of the other, like the unique comparisons against other SIMs in the market against the Huntress product?
Yeah, I think the other big piece too, and again, this is coming from someone who has ran a multitude of SIM solutions, anything from Elastic to Splunk to Logarithm before it became Exabeam to QRadar. Kind of, I even ran an RSA Envision way back in the day. So name a SIM, and I probably I probably worked with it to some degree. Kind of the other big piece on the Huntress end is we are a fully managed solution, and what I mean by that is, as a partner, as a customer of the Huntress SIM, you don't need to worry about parsers. You don't need to worry about managing the rule base. You don't need to worry about managing any of the backend infrastructure, right? So if I use Elastic as an example, right, they've got a suite of indexers that are on the back end, which is ultimately where the data gets stored, et cetera. That's something that no Huntress customer ever has to worry about. You don't need to worry about, split brains on who's the master in an array of indexes or anything like that. So a lot of the overhead in terms of people resources is not there. I mean, sure, you still, we're still going to send you stuff and be like, hey, we saw this bad thing, just like anyone who has experience with the Huntress EDR or IT EDR products. We're still going to send you the reports and like, hey, we found this bad thing. And then, what do you want to do about it, et cetera? Or in some cases, we've identified some potential misconfigurations that, can cause disruption to the service we're trying to provide. But like, you don't have to worry about that whole infrastructure component. As a comparison, so one of the places I worked at, which was a Splunk shop for a Fortune 50 company, we had a team of, I think it was like 8 or 9 people, and their only job was to keep Splunk running, and we were using Splunk Cloud. So we didn't even have to
Wow.
worry about like the heavy side of the
Or like
infrastructure.
servers, power cores, nothing like that.
Yeah, like because in Splunk they have this architecture with forwarders, heavy forwarders, et cetera, and like all those still had to be managed and maintained inside of our environment. And there was a team of 10 people. Now with
Yeah, and parsing the data
due
is
to
a
the size of
challenge.
that, oh, for sure, like that's I think the biggest bit. Like you see that in like every CISO's concern has lately been, can I find the resources to do the job that we need to do to protect the business? And if there's a way to, eliminate or kind of air quote outsource, uh, some of that management, I think that's a big win.
So the product has been out for a few months. What have you been hearing from some of the early customers and early adopters?
Yeah, so a lot of the early adopters are trying to fulfill some compliance needs around, hey, you need to offshore your data and those types of pieces. So everything has been going well there. Like they've been happy that being able to get that data off of their systems into ours, so that they're in a place that to help satisfy those compliance requirements. And in addition, the cyber insurance requirements are starting to get into that same boat, where it's like, hey, you need to offshore your logs in order for to check the box off of the cyber insurance list as well, or their list of demands. We've had a number of customers work through doing the search, so that's also kind of a new thing on Huntress's end. So in previous products, an end user or a partner of ours, they didn't really have the ability to search their data that we were collecting from, say, the EDR, from the ITDR services. But now in the SIEM space, you can log into the Huntress portal. You can go to a log section within the portal, and you can search against your data, and you can find things there. We've published on that same support page, where you can find how to configure our supported devices. There's also a list of kind of starter queries. So if you're sending us Windows logs, if you're using Sophos, SonicWall, or FortiGates, there's some starter queries that you can use to just copy paste, and it'll come out with results that can show some interesting stuff. Again, not necessarily, hey, these are security things that you need to go remediate, but an example in Windows is, cool, let me run a search to show the users that have been added to the local admin group on my local Windows device, or remote desktop users group, right?
Which
Like
is
these are
definitely a
groups that
potential
grant,
security event.
yeah, like these are groups that grant extra privilege, like and potentially a security risk, or add more risk. But there's a lot of cases where it's like, well, that's normal, right? That's just normal business operations, and mostly to be able to generate those reports to validate, like, hey, that happened. Um, on the firewall side, like there's a couple in there around like firewall rule changes. Again, like potential risk, but that's again normal business operations, and that's something that can be really used to help validate change control. So approved versus unapproved changes. So there's a few bits that are available there. I think that the customers have found value in.
So talking about like volume of data. So Huntress's SIM product has an integration with DNS filter. And I know, like, for example, if I turned on DNS filter at my home, that would generate on average 30,000 DNS queries per day. Obviously, the SIM doesn't need to know about all of those, but some of them would be very interesting and needed to be stored. So I want to talk about the DNS filter integration, but in the aspect of why DNS queries are so cool to add to your collection of data, and not necessarily about the implementation, because I read through the Huntress support docs and it's like 5 steps. So that's kind of
Right.
the easy bit. Go ahead.
Yeah, thankfully it's one of the easier integrations. But yeah, in terms of the data from, say, DNS filter, so when in general, when I think about like categorizing data, I usually put it into one of 4 buckets. So there's a bucket that's like, hey, this data is useful for creating some type of detection, right? I'm going to use this data to directly drive a detection capability. Then there's kind of a supporting set. So there's the next bucket, and this is where a lot of DNS logs will fall into. Is they're going to fall into this secondary bucket. It's like, hey, I may not create a detection purely off of DNS. There might be some edge cases where I would, but it really helps to facilitate the investigation aspect. So if there's some suspicious or potentially malicious behavior that I'm seeing on a host, one of the beginning places I'm going to look at is like, okay, well, what DNS queries are being done? Is you can toss out the like, oh, they queried Google or MSN or whatever, right? Like you can toss out a whole bunch as you're saying as just general background, but it's really interesting to see kind of the one-offs, see the ones that are rare or haven't been seen before. And in the case of DNS filters functionality, it's like, hey, what did it block? Like what was being tried that it prevented, and then why did it prevent it? Like, is it just in a tracking category? Which, I mean, a tracking cookie is a tracking cookie. I'm like, sure, there have been malicious uses of them, but most of it's just like, I don't want to get tracked. uh, but yeah, like that's and it is potentially voluminous. Like that's kind of the bit on there too, and that's where having some of the pre-filtering helps out. Now, again, not necessarily on the DNS side, because I am kind of curious about DNS queries as a whole, because they do provide some level of insight as far as the investigation standpoint.
Yeah,
But
that
yeah,
is a good
there's
point. So you can see like the ancillary events around something that happens, something that maybe was alerted, through like Microsoft 365 or, some other system, and then see like within a time frame around that event, what DNS queries we're firing off. So you may want to save them all
yeah,
for at least
absolutely.
some period of time.
Yeah, and if I look at if we look back, and I've worked with while they back way before they were absorbed by Google with Mandiant and investigators, and in a few cases where they were brought on for a company I worked for, and kind of outside of just give me logs. Like the first couple things that they would target and they would ask for is like, give me all of your DHCP logs for the last X number of days, and then give me all of your DNS logs for the X number of days. Like those are some of the first questions they're going to ask for because of kind of the extra, as you said, like ancillary or supporting value that comes in. And I think that's where in the SIM space, especially, uh, these types of events, these supporting things provide context that is sorely lacking in just one-off logs by themselves, right? Like if I look at say someone launched Chrome or someone launched some application on their host, like that's cool. Like, all right, I see that, and I can see by turning a couple dials, like extra command line switches or arguments that were passed in. Like, okay, but again, that on its own doesn't necessarily say, hey, this is bad, this is good, this is. You need to add kind of those extra bits in there. The extra context around it and what's going on while that's occurring. And that's really the power of where SIM solutions come into play, is being able to combine and correlate different data types from different sources together to paint a better picture and to connect dots and connect threads to show progressive activity as opposed to just, I saw this one thing this one time.
Yeah, so that's great to hear. Like I've always thought that, but I've never, I'm not a SIM expert. I'm not a SOC operations specialist. So I've never been in that environment. But I just can imagine that the DNS queries around something are pretty valuable to for that investigation, as you mentioned. So I want to transition a little bit into SIM, Splunk, now Huntress. Like these are big. Like Splunk is a huge company. Enterprise is the enterprise ecosystem. Probably often uses SIMs or similar technology to correlate or collate all their logs, and have teams of 8 in some instances to manage. So it's kind of daunting. Like the SIM environment is kind of scary. So like Huntress and DNS Filter were very big with MSPs, who are often helping small businesses and sometimes larger businesses. But how is Huntress and the release you have reducing the friction for small businesses and MSPs to get into the SIM game?
Yeah, and as I said, I think the kind of the biggest piece is the not requiring kind of the extra resources to manage and maintain. Because as you said, like in most of my experience prior, or well, my experience in as working for specific companies has been in kind of the Fortune 500 or the larger enterprise space. So yeah, they had the resources, the teams to manage and implement and run these types of tools. The last company I was at, the Fortune 50 healthcare company, right? Our security department was larger than Huntress is, like, as a whole. We had more people just in security than Huntress has in the entire company. So
Wow.
it's interesting seeing that dynamic. But yeah, the from the small and medium business size, as our CEO Kyle has called it, the Fortune 5,000 to the Fortune 5 million, uh, they don't really have the dedicated resources. Even our MSP partners, they are a lot of it focused on the keep the lights on kind of stuff, the maintenance, the caring of whether it be server infrastructure, firewall infrastructure, et cetera. I mean, some of them, sure, they might have 10 people on staff, but there's just one person that does security half the time. Uh, and most of that's just, hey,
It's like
alerts are getting
their
generated.
SOC is one guy.
Right, right. And so the kind of end goal, right, is to alleviate as much of the admin burn as possible, and that is probably one of the biggest resource lifesavers. Um, that's not to say make it zero, right? Like, it's impossible to kind of make it absolutely nothing. I mean, even if we look at, say, like the Hunter CDR side of things, right? You still have to install the agent. Same thing on SIEM. You still have to install the agent. You still have to update the agent, right? There's still some administrative activity, but removing as much as we possibly can from that. Making the onboarding of sources easy. As you said, like the DNS filter guide is like 5 clicks, and the most you have to do is generate a key and plop that into a web page somewhere. Um, some of them are a little more complicated. But yeah, try to make that as easy as possible in order to bring on new devices. Um, and just general provide as much insight kind of by default that we can, right? So if we're seeing, say, hey, something operationally isn't healthy, so like an agent hasn't communicated or a data source hasn't communicated, so, our goal is to notify and say, hey, this hasn't talked, or is that okay, or this configuration is precluding good functionality or something like that. um, and then not having to be responsible for writing all of the detection logic itself, right? Like, we're going to be doing that on our end. Our SOC exists to do that. It's part of the fully managed kind of Huntress solution, right? Is it comes to our SOC first. So we're not going to send all of the potential alerts or everything that the SIM components produce down to our partners or customers. It's all going to be vetted and validated by a human before we end up doing that.
Well, that is
So the
really impressive. That is a huge differentiator because you're getting, the expertise of Huntress and your SOC as the final filter of what gets sent to you.
Yeah, it's 100%. I think that's, coming from, as I said, like, coming from my background of being the one who's been in the trenches, who's been doing the SecOps, whether it be from an analyst or an engineer perspective. That if there was someone in front that I could trust and be like, hey, can you filter out all the junk? That would be great.
Yeah, the human
Uh,
firewall. Awesome.
Basically, yes. Because I know I've worked with a number of MSPs myself, and there's good and bad across kind of the MSP space. Like, some of that, and I think a lot of that comes through like the level of resources that are in there, the kind of expertise of those resources, et cetera. So for anyone who's been using Huntress before, right, they can see the level of expertise of our SOC with what gets passed through from our EDR and ITDR systems today, and that same level of service is what we're aiming for from the SIM side as well. That's not to say that we're perfect, right? There will still be some things that will pop through, and there have been some that we've already notified. It's like, oh yeah, I was vulnerability scanning or something like that. And it's like, okay, well, or I was doing a pen test,
You're like,
or something like that.
someone is
But at the
vulnerability
end,
scanning your network right now. They're like, yeah, I
yeah,
know it's me.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Like, we've picked up, it's like, oh hey, we saw a Kali workstation on your network. Like, oh yeah, that was me. I was doing some pen testing. Like, okay,
Yeah.
great. Like, but hey, I'm okay catching pen testers. Like, I have no issues catching pen testers.
Yeah. I mean, you should. That's the whole purpose.
Right,
That's the pen
exactly.
test.
I have been
So
at orgs where they get mad when we catch the pen tester. I'm like, what? Wait a second. Why? I don't
I
understand.
saw I saw a hilarious Reddit thread like a week or two ago. A MSP was getting requested to open the firewall ports for a pen tester, and he was like, that's a failed pen test. Like we are doing our job, so like pen test over."
Yeah, I've gotten that too. It's like, hey, can you create an account and put it in the domain admin group for us? Like, no.
They're
Like,
like, "That's cheating."
sorry.
And also, just back to the last point about all that, the DNS filter and Huntress, like they're kind of on this mission to democratize cybersecurity, make it simple, make it easy, make it affordable, so that the small business and MSP can have enterprise grade security. And I recently heard an interviewer ask a question about security posture between, like, say, the CIA and your mom and pop retail store that sells like dog biscuits or whatever. And the answer is their security posture is the same. Obviously there's many differences, but they should think like the same. They should be seeking out SIEM tools to monitor things. They should be seeking out DNS filtering. The question is which products they should buy. The CIA probably builds in-house and contracts, whoever to build some pretty advanced systems, whereas we are giving the same tools to MSPs and SMBs.
Yeah, 100%. So a lot of my, direct employer experience has been in healthcare orgs. So whether that be a insurance company, whether that be a provider, so a company that has had hospitals and clinics, and most of them have been large, right? But the risks to a healthcare org that has, 4 hospitals and 75 clinics is pretty much the same as a company or as a dental office that has 4, or as an individual practitioner, like a pair of doctors or whatnot that have a small family practice. The overall risks are the same. Now, sure, the amount of, or not really the amount, but the exposure is smaller, right? Their footprint is smaller, so there's
Right.
less
Like they're not going to
endpoints to
shut down
protect.
all the airports across the world if something goes wrong.
Right, right. But like they still hold kind of the really interesting and really important data that attackers are going to want. They are still as susceptible to ransomware attacks as the big guys are, right? Like, I mean, there was the Change Healthcare ransomware attack from earlier in the year, right? That affected a huge number of small practices because that's how they get paid. So yeah, and it's not that they're not at risk just because they're small. The risk is still there. It's just their exposure, so the number of endpoints are small. Like that's
Yeah,
really kind of it. The data is still
exactly.
still interesting, and a lot of them will still have connections back. So like I know in doctors that I've gone to, if they haven't been part of kind of a major network, they'll still have data sharing. They still even potentially have direct links back to, say, in a Lina or a Mayo or UHG or what have you type of
Yeah,
network to share medical data.
yeah, exactly. And I would argue that the repercussions are actually more severe. So like think of your health company that you worked at. Let's say they had a $2 million recovery cost for some type of event. Well, they could absorb that. Whereas your mom and pop dental office, they're probably out of business.
Yeah. And one of the things that the High Tech Act, so kind of the follow up to HIPAA, added was kind of teeth. So they added more from a punishment perspective, in terms of if you lose data, if you lose records, etc. And so yeah, there are some financial repercussions tied to that, and 100%, like a larger organization is able to absorb those far easier than a smaller. And I've had this kind of discussion and argument with doctors in the past around cybersecurity, and it's like, hey, the number one thing you think of as a physician or as a doctor or as a medical professional is, hey, I care. Patient care is top of priority, right? That's always the thing you hear top of mind inside of hospitals, like patient care, patient care, patient care. We do XYZ because of patient care. Like, well, good cybersecurity practices is also patient care, right?
Exactly.
When a patient or someone comes in and they're providing you things like their social security number, they're providing you medical insurance information, they're providing you insurance information, all of this sort of stuff, like they're expecting a level of care on your side to protect their data so that some nefarious individual or entity doesn't come in and take it and then use it for whatever. So I would argue that in those scenarios, right, cybersecurity is patient care, like the thing that you should put top of mind as a medical professional.
Yeah, the patient data is essentially the patient itself or their self.
Hundred
How you
percent.
say that? All right.
And
So
and particularly with healthcare data, it's immutable, right? Like it doesn't change.
exactly.
As opposed to say something like credit card data. I mean, the banking industry has kind of been on top of cybersecurity for a long time because hey, there's real dollar costs for fraud, and they've gotten they can get almost in front of it basically. Like, I've gotten calls from Capital One, which is one of the banks I've worked with. It's like, hey, we saw a random transaction, blah, blah, blah. Was this you? And I say no. I'm like, all right, well, we reverse the transaction, immediately cancel your card and send you out a new one. Right? Like that's something that credit cards can do. You can't get a new social security number, for example. You can't get a
Exactly.
new medical record number inside of an organization. Like that's not a thing.
You could change your name, but that's a big hassle.
But your social's still the same.
Exactly.
That's
So
signed at birth. It's from birth to death. You'll have the same number.
tell me about, so this is like, let's get a little nerdy about some of the happenings that you've seen in your lifespan as the SOC analyst. Have you, I didn't ask you this before, but have you seen any crazy like cyber event?
Let's see. Nothing like there have been a couple that have occurred kind of before I joined an organization. So one of the projects I've been involved with was deploying a secure USB or secure flash drive system. And that all originated because someone did the thing that you hear about, but you never think happens, which is picking
They
up a
put the
USB in a parking lot and plugging it into a computer. It's like if you remember, like long time ago, I worked at Geek Squad as kind of one of their techs, and you always hear stories about the cup holder stories, right? It's like, hey, my cup holder's broken on my computer. I'm like, well, what do you mean? Like, oh, that thing where I press the button and it pops out. They're referring to their CD drive, but like you never think like, oh, that's a real thing. And likewise in the security space, I never think like, oh, someone just picked up a random flash drive and thought this would be a good idea just to
Yeah,
plug
like
into my
I
work
went to
computer.
Las Vegas during a conference called DEF CON or something, and I found this USB stick and I put
Yeah,
it
and
in my
like I just found
computer.
this thing, like oh, so that kind of drove. That was a bit of a snafu again with the org before I joined on. So one of the projects I was involved with was deploying these kind of secure and encrypted USBs and creating the policies and implementing the technical controls around not even allowing other ones to mount like into the system.
Ah,
Uh, so yeah, a
I
whole
was I
bunch of
was gonna
stuff tied
ask
into
like
that.
how did that work? Like you're saying you created software essentially that would only allow a USB stick with a specific signature to mount.
Yeah, it was is tied to there's a particular piece of software that essentially will just not allow it to mount. So it'll just dismount it from the system. Like you plug it in and you'll see a thing that you'll see the little windows pop that says, "Oh, doing an onboarding or adding device," and then shortly thereafter it'd be like
That's
device
a,
disconnected, and only allowing in kind of a specific kind of category. Like that's and wrapping back to kind of the logging in the SIEM space, that's one of the things that Microsoft implemented. I want to say it was in like 2012 or 2012 R2, and then correspondingly, I think it was Windows 7, maybe 8, where they started recording a lot more information around plug and play devices, of which a removable media drive, like a thumb drive or flash stick, is considered a plug and play device.
mm-hmm.
I
I
think
can't
the
believe
other
that
one
actually
wasn't
really
really a
happened.
security. Well, it could have been a security thing, but it wound up not being like the root cause of it. So the org I worked at, they as with most larger organizations, right, the desktop team and the server team are split from each other, right? There's a team that manages the desktop fleet, and there's a team that manages kind of the Windows servers and Linux servers, etc. Um, and the way that and we used the Windows updates, so SMS and whatnot, in order to do all of the updates. Like, hey, push updates, cool, great, normal Windows kind of
Patch Tuesday.
functionality. There were a bunch of like scripts and things tied into there too. But as part of the scripts, one of the things that it would do is it would add on the desktop side, it was add forced reboots. So every like week, your system would reboot, which is generally good hygiene. Like, you want to reboot every now and then, just for general like operating system health. And then now recently, I saw the recommendation of rebooting your phone that the FBI kind of came out with. But anyway, regular reboots of things are not bad, like, and generally are a good thing. So there was a scheduled task that got pushed, and there were some accounts that would get created, like the admin account that the workstation team would use to do remote administration, right? They'd have something that gets added into every workstation's administrators group. Like, okay, fine. Like, again, all normal stuff. Well, in the SIEM one day, I got an alert that says, hey, the enterprise admin account named XYZ got changed. And for those unfamiliar with what enterprise admin is, so in a Windows domain environment, people hear domain admin all the time. Like, okay, yep, everyone kind of, I think, relatively knows what a domain admin is. Well, the domain admin is one tier under an enterprise admin. So, and these both get created when you set up Active Directory. So domain admins are allowed to do stuff within that particular domain. Enterprise admin can affect the entire forest. So if you have multiple domains under, say, a forest, then enterprise admin can do anything it wants to any of them. Essentially, it's domain admin across all domains. Well, those accounts that are in the really never, ever be touched. Like, you generally don't use them because they are so risky. And the passwords for them are, you commonly like just throwing some random password generator at like 45 characters because you really don't want those impacted. Well, so as I said, I got an alert that says, hey, this got changed. I dig into it and end up messaging some server admins. And oh, by the way, this was at 3:30 on a Friday afternoon, which kind of lines up with when attackers do crap because they're like, oh, it's a weekend. But long story short, digging through it, found out that, oh, the GPO and the scripts that were getting assigned to the workstation fleets somehow got assigned to the server fleet. And which normally would be like, okay, well, I guess someone just needs to go change stuff. But if you remember earlier, there was a reboot script task that got auto-created. So there was a reboot task that got created on all Windows servers to reboot at like 8 p.m. Sunday. So the entire Windows server infrastructure of like 3,000 servers would have rebooted at 8 p.m. on Sunday, which, again, not horrible, I guess. Like, there would probably be a service disruption, but where it becomes especially, in this case, poignant is the org I was at had hospitals and clinics. So if these servers were running like Epic, were running the EMR system, these servers were running the things that displayed, say, your stats, like patient stats, within different rooms. Like, so essentially, like, if these would have rebooted, it would have shut everything down and could have had some pretty potential significant patient impacts. So yeah, like, that's, again, it wasn't a security issue as in like, hey, malicious behavior. It was a misconfiguration that could have had some pretty drastic impacts to the business.
Yeah, but you caught it and you fixed it, and that's what humans are for.
Yep, we caught it. We fixed it. No servers rebooted on 8 p.m. on Sunday.
Yeah, AI is not ready to take over yet. Maybe one day, just not yet.
Nope.
Speaking of AI and Next, what do you What do you think the future looks like for SIM product? Not necessarily Huntress specifically, but just in general, like logging and alerting. What do you think we're going to see in the near future?
Yeah, I think, well, from kind of the general business perspective, like we've seen it within the last year, uh, some organizational mergers, so some M&A actions that have occurred, right? So Cisco bought Splunk, you've got Logarithm and Exabeam merging together, you got Palo Alto that purchased Curator off of IBM. Um, so I suspect that some of that's going to continue, at least from kind of the business side of the house, like the organization side. In terms of the overall kind of functionality, so a lot of the SIM vendors are kind of touting the AI, ML, and UEBA kind of functionality, which there is some benefit to. I'm not going to say that there's zero. However, it does feel like a lot of it is in its very early stages or infancy when it comes to providing kind of the value for what you have to give it. I do expect that that's going to kind of going to continue over time, right? In general IT, there's been this fear that AI is going to come in and replace jobs. And I don't necessarily think that's going to 100% be the case. Sure, I think there might be some reduction in, say, resources required to perform a task, but I see AI, particularly from the SOC perspective, coming in as much more of a helper and as something that can do a lot of kind of automation and a lot of like regular tasks easier. Um, Ultimately, just kind of leveraging what SOAR, so security orchestration and response, like has been doing for years, is kind of augmenting that, adding into that, adding some more context to things, and being able to handle a lot of those pieces there. That being said, too, on the UEBA front, so for those unfamiliar with the acronym, user and entity behavioral analytics, or user endpoint behavior analytics, um, there's some interesting things there too. Again, it's something that has been around for a bit. You've got in the case of some of the vendors out there, particularly Exabeam, like they really push that UEBA is kind of the future and whatnot. And yeah, there is some decided interesting use cases in that space. Um, Things around like profiling users and looking for behavioral anomalies, not
Yeah.
just, hey, I saw this process do this thing, but it's looking at how people work and looking at what systems that accounts typically access and looking for behavioral or, you outliers to kind of the general baselines. I think that all of those solutions have to contend with their false positive rates, which are significantly higher than they kind of really need to be. So I suspect that there's going to be a lot more development in that space too, to tune down and to kind of cut out a lot of that false positive activity. That's the one I would say downside with kind of behavioral based analytics is, yeah, unless you get your models really, really tight, the false positive detection rate is pretty high,
Yeah, that's interesting.
especially for like your server kind, your administrative staff, your IT staff, because they operate abnormally all the time, right? Like if you think about like, hey, it's my Windows Server team. Well, there is no kind of regular logins that they do to systems, right? They bounce between systems in order to fix problems or what have you. So a lot of it's going to be very, very hard to baseline and find abnormality. And that is arguably your most risky accounts are those that have those administrative activities. So those are the ones you would want to monitor more closely, but they're also their behavior isn't consistent. So it's hard to apply those behavioral analytics to them.
Yeah, because randomness is more frequent, actually. It's like randomness is normalcy. But
Yeah,
that
if
is
you're
really
if you're
interesting.
trying
Like
to watch,
the user behavior, recording all of that data is going to be a tremendous amount of data. It's very hard to measure, but
it
then
is.
adding on top of that, AI, ML, let's say deciphering and regurgitation and alert setting, with that extra data may be a great future.
Yeah, as I said, it'll be really interesting if they can start to create kind of better or more narrow focused models in that space. I think there is a lot of value to be had around looking at behavior. I mean, if you think about it from, say, like the law enforcement perspective, like that's one of the big things they look for is they look for behavior changes, right? Like the way that one of the ways that the FBI looks for potential terrorism is they'll like get flags on certain types of transactions, right? It's like, oh, hey, someone bought 10,000 pounds of nitrate based fertilizer. That throws up a red flag, like, right? Like these are abnormalities or differences in behavior that they'll be looking for. And the same holds true in the security space, right? We expect systems to behave a certain way and expect accounts and people to behave a certain way, and then looking for things that go fall outside those norms are an absolute, potential indicator. But I think, relying solely kind of on that is something you don't really want to do, because that you need more context, you need more breadcrumbs to kind of connect and to build that chain of events to really say, like, yeah, this is true malicious behavior, or rather than, oh, hey, this is just because John had to log into the email server because it had a problem.
Exactly. Well, Tony, thank you so much for joining me today. We're out of time, folks. That was actually a lot of fun. Um, I've never had as much fun talking about Sims, but it was a blast. Thank you, Tony, for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for having me.